On the morning of June 15, 1985, Elena Mirova was getting ready for her wedding when she found a photograph that would destroy everything she believed about her father. The house in Bethesda, Maryland, a modest split level her parents had bought in 1968, was filled with the controlled chaos that comes with a family preparing for a major event. Her mother, Susan, was downstairs coordinating with the caterers who had arrived early to load supplies into their van. Her younger brother, David, had been sent to pick up the flowers from a shop in Rockville. And Elena was in her parents' bedroom, searching through her mother's jewelry box for something borrowed, a tradition she hadn't particularly cared about until her maid of honor had reminded her the previous evening that she was missing that particular item from the customary 4. The bedroom smelled the way it always had, a combination of her mother's lavender sachets and her father's Old Spice aftershave, scents so familiar they had become invisible to her until this morning, when everything felt heightened and significant. The jewelry box, a wooden container with a brass clasp that her father had given her mother on their 20th anniversary, sat on top of the dresser near the window where morning light came through the half-open blinds. Elena had been sorting through necklaces and bracelets, looking for the pearl earrings her mother had worn at her own wedding, when she noticed that the bottom of the jewelry box sat slightly higher than the depth of the box suggested it should. She pressed on the felt lining, and it gave way, revealing a false bottom and a small compartment beneath. Inside that compartment was a single photograph, approximately 4 by 6 inches, printed on the kind of thick paper stock that wasn't common anymore. The image showed a group of men standing in front of a building she didn't recognize, their posture formal, their expression serious. They wore dark suits and medals, the kind of military decorations she'd seen in history books but never in person. And standing third from the left, younger but unmistakably recognizable, was her father, Victor Mirova, the man who had taught her to ride a bicycle on this street when she was 6, the man who had attended every piano recital, every school play, every parent-teacher conference throughout her childhood, the man who, in approximately 4 hours, would walk her down the aisle of St. Michael's Church and give her away to Thomas Brennan, the man she'd been dating for 2 years and living with for 6 months. But the Victor in this photograph wasn't the electrical engineer who worked at Applied Systems, Inc., and came home every evening at 6:15. This Victor wore a Soviet military uniform with medals she couldn't identify, and he stood among men whose faces carried the particular intensity of people who believed absolutely in something larger than themselves. Elena turned the photograph over, her hands shaking slightly, and found an inscription written in Cyrillic script on the back. Her Russian was limited to the handful of phrases her father had taught her as a child, simple things like hello and thank you and I love you, but she could make out a date, 1959, and one word that made her stomach drop, komitet, committee. The word every American who'd grown up during the Cold War knew even if they didn't speak Russian. The Committee for State Security, the KGB. Elena sat down on the edge of her parents' bed, still holding the photograph, and tried to reconcile what she was seeing with what she knew. Her father had come to America in 1962, 23 years ago, fleeing the Soviet Union, or so the story had always gone. He'd arrived with almost nothing, worked his way through night school while holding down 2 jobs, earned his engineering degree, met her mother at a church social in 1964, married her 6 months later. Elena had been born in 1961, and David in 1964. They were the American success story, the immigrant family that had embraced their new country and built a good life through hard work and determination. Victor spoke about the old country only rarely, and when he did, it was with a mixture of nostalgia and relief, grateful to have escaped, but occasionally wistful for things he'd left behind. But this photograph suggested something else entirely. It had been taken in 1959, 3 years before Victor claimed to have arrived in America. And he wasn't a refugee or a student in this image. He was wearing a military uniform with medals and standing with men who looked like officers or officials. Elena's mind began working through possibilities, trying to find an explanation that didn't lead to the conclusion forming in the back of her thoughts. Perhaps he'd served in the military before leaving, which wasn't suspicious. Many young men served. Perhaps the photograph had been taken at some ceremonial event that meant nothing. Perhaps the word she'd read on the back wasn't what she thought it was. But she knew what it was. And she knew, with a certainty that made her feel sick, that her wedding day, the day that was supposed to be about beginning a new life with Thomas, had just become something else entirely. Elena replaced the photograph in the hidden compartment and closed the jewelry box, her movements mechanical, her mind operating on 2 levels simultaneously. On one level, she was a bride, getting ready for her wedding, checking her watch and realizing she needed to finish her makeup and put on her dress. On another level, she was someone who had just discovered that her entire understanding of her family might be based on a lie, and she was trying to decide what to do with that information in the 3.5 hours remaining before the ceremony. She chose, in that moment, to do nothing. Not because she'd made a conscious decision to wait, but because the alternative, confronting her father or canceling the wedding or calling someone, anyone, to report what she'd found, seemed impossible to execute in the time available. So she went downstairs, smiled at her mother, accepted a glass of orange juice, and began the process of becoming a bride, while the photograph burned in her mind like something she'd looked at too long in bright light. The ceremony at St. Michael's Church began at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. Elena stood in the vestibule with her father, her arm linked through his, waiting for the organ music that would signal their entrance. Victor looked distinguished in his gray suit, his hair, which had gone white at the temples over the past few years, neatly combed, his expression showing what she'd always interpreted as pride mixed with the melancholy that came with giving away a daughter. He squeezed her arm gently and told her she looked beautiful, and Elena heard herself thank him, her voice sounding normal even though she was looking at his face and wondering if she'd ever actually known the man behind it. When the music began and they started walking down the aisle, she became acutely aware of his hand on her arm, the physical contact feeling suddenly foreign, as if the hand belonged to a stranger who'd learned to perform the gestures of fatherhood convincingly enough to fool everyone, including her, for 24 years. The reception was held at a hotel in downtown Bethesda, a ballroom with cream-colored walls and crystal chandeliers that her mother had selected 8 months earlier. Elena moved through the afternoon in a kind of dissociative state, smiling for photographs, cutting the cake, dancing with Thomas, all while watching her father from across the room and noticing things she'd never paid attention to before. The way he stood slightly apart from groups of people even when he was part of the conversation, maintaining a position that allowed him to observe the room. The way he deflected personal questions from Thomas's relatives about his life in the Soviet Union, redirecting conversations with practiced ease. The way his English, after 23 years in America, still carried that slight accent that people found charming, that made him sound educated and distinguished rather than foreign. When Victor gave his toast, standing at the microphone with a champagne glass in his hand, he spoke about freedom and opportunity, about how America had given him the chance to build a life he never could have had in the country of his birth. He talked about meeting Susan, about the joy of watching his children grow up in a nation where they could become anything they wanted to be. He spoke about Elena's intelligence and determination, qualities he claimed she'd inherited from her mother, and he wished her and Thomas a long and happy marriage filled with the same love and partnership he'd found with Susan. The guests applauded, many of them visibly moved by the immigrant father's heartfelt words, and Elena stood there next to her new husband, clapping along with everyone else, thinking about the photograph hidden in her mother's jewelry box and wondering how much of what her father had just said was true and how much was performance. That evening, after the reception had ended and the guests had departed, Elena sat in her hotel room with Thomas, who sensed immediately that something was wrong. He asked if she was all right, if the day had been too overwhelming, if she was having second thoughts about the marriage. Elena wanted to tell him, wanted to share the burden of what she'd discovered, but Thomas worked at the State Department, a mid-level position in the Bureau of European and Eurasian Affairs that required a security clearance. If her father was what that photograph suggested he might be, telling Thomas would trigger obligations that would take the decision out of her hands entirely. So she told him she was fine, just exhausted, and they should get some sleep because they had a long drive ahead of them the next day to begin their honeymoon in Virginia Beach. But the following morning, Elena called Thomas's supervisor and claimed there'd been a family emergency, that her grandmother was ill and they needed to postpone the trip. Thomas, confused and increasingly concerned, asked what was happening, and Elena promised she would explain everything soon, but needed a few days to handle something important. Then she called her brother David, who was back at his apartment near the University of Maryland, and asked him to meet her at a coffee shop in College Park that afternoon. When David arrived, Elena showed him a copy of the photograph she'd gone back to her parents' house that morning to retrieve and copy at a drugstore. David studied the image for several minutes, his expression shifting from curiosity to skepticism to something resembling alarm. His first response was to suggest there had to be a reasonable explanation, that their father had probably served in the Soviet military before emigrating, which wasn't unusual or suspicious. But when Elena pointed out the date on the back and explained that it was 3 years before Victor claimed to have arrived in America, David's certainty faltered. Elena told him they needed to search their father's office at home, that they needed to find out what else he might be hiding before they decided what to do next. Victor left for his monthly fishing trip on the morning of June 22nd, a Saturday, departing at 6:30 in the morning, as he always did, his tackle box and rod already loaded in the trunk of his Buick. He would be gone until Sunday evening, camping at a lake in Pennsylvania with 2 colleagues from Applied Systems, Inc. Or, at least, that was what he told Susan when he kissed her goodbye and reminded her to water the tomato plants in the backyard. Elena and David waited until 8 o'clock, giving their father enough time to be well out of the area before they drove to the house in Bethesda. Susan had left earlier to visit her sister in Baltimore for the weekend, a trip she'd planned months in advance, which meant the house was empty and they would have several hours to search without interruption or the need to explain what they were doing. Victor's office was located in the converted garage, a space he'd finished himself over the course of several summers in the mid-70s, installing drywall and carpeting and building shelves along 3 of the 4 walls. The room contained his desk, a large oak piece he'd bought at an estate sale, multiple filing cabinets, and the ham radio equipment that had been his hobby for as long as Elena could remember. As a child, she'd spent hours in this room watching her father communicate with other enthusiasts around the world, listening to him explain radio frequencies and signal propagation with the patient clarity of a natural teacher. Now, she stood in the doorway, looking at the space and seeing it differently, wondering if the radio equipment had ever been used for purposes that had nothing to do with hobby communication. The locked filing cabinet stood against the far wall, a 4-drawer metal unit in gray. Elena had noticed the lock many times over the years, but had never questioned it, assuming her father kept work documents or financial records inside that required security. David tried the drawers and confirmed they were locked, then asked where they should start looking for a key. Elena remembered something her father had taught her when she was 12, after a storm had knocked out power to the house for 3 days. He'd shown her how to check electrical outlets for loose connections, how to use a voltage tester, and where the backup fuses were stored. He'd been methodical about teaching her practical skills, insisting that everyone in the family should know how to handle basic electrical problems. She walked to the outlet behind the desk, removed the cover plate with a screwdriver from the tool drawer, and found a small silver key taped to the inside of the electrical box. They photographed everything before touching it, using David's camera, a Nikon he'd bought for his photography class the previous semester. Elena wanted a complete record of exactly how things looked before they disturbed anything, understanding that if their father noticed something out of place, the investigation would end immediately. Then she unlocked the filing cabinet and began removing items one by one, laying them on the desk where David could photograph each piece of evidence under the bright halogen lamp their father used for close work. The first drawer contained what appeared to be legitimate documents, tax returns dating back to 1963, insurance policies, the deed to the house, medical records for the entire family. But beneath these ordinary papers, at the very bottom of the drawer, wrapped in a plastic bag, were 3 passports. Elena opened each one carefully, her hands shaking slightly as she examined them. The first showed her father's photograph with the name Victor Mirova and stamps indicating entries and exits from the United States dating back to 1962, which matched the story he'd always told about his arrival in America. The second passport was Canadian, issued to a man named Peter Volkov, but the photograph was unmistakably her father, perhaps 10 years younger than his current age. The third was West German, issued to Klaus Werner, again with her father's face. Both of these passports showed multiple stamps from the 1970s and early 1980s, indicating international travel Elena had never known about. The second drawer contained radio equipment that looked more sophisticated than what sat on the shelves in plain view. There were frequency charts, technical manuals written in Russian, and small electronic components she couldn't identify but that looked purposeful and expensive. Tucked inside one of the manuals was a folded piece of paper covered in handwritten Russian text arranged in columns, the kind of structured format that suggested code or cipher. David photographed every page of the manual and both sides of the coded letter, while Elena continued searching. The third drawer held photographs, dozens of them, showing various locations around Washington. Some were ordinary tourist shots of monuments and government buildings, but others showed less obvious locations, parking garages and parks and street corners, each photograph marked on the back with dates and times written in pencil. There were also photographs of people, men and women in business attire, some of the images appearing to have been taken from a distance without the subject's knowledge. One series of photographs showed a man leaving an office building, getting into a car, driving to a residential neighborhood, the sequence documenting his routine over what appeared to be several days. The fourth drawer contained maps of the Washington metropolitan area, not the simple road maps available at any gas station, but detailed street maps with locations marked in different colored inks. Some marks corresponded to government buildings, others to residential addresses. One map showed the route from their house in Bethesda to multiple locations in Virginia, including an address in McLean that Elena recognized as the location where Thomas worked. Her father had marked Thomas's office building on a map 6 months before Elena and Thomas had gotten engaged, possibly longer, depending on when the marking had been made. At the bottom of this final drawer, beneath the maps and underneath a folder of what appeared to be utility bills, was a document that removed any remaining doubt about what Victor had been doing for the past 23 years. It was a typed sheet on thin paper, the kind used for carbon copies, with the text in Russian across the top and a photograph of her father stapled to the corner. Elena's Russian wasn't good enough to read most of it, but she could make out certain words. The date, 1961, a full year before her father claimed to have arrived in America. A phrase that included the word illegal, which she knew in this context meant something specific in intelligence terminology, and at the bottom, a signature and an official stamp. David photographed the document from multiple angles while Elena sat in her father's desk chair, staring at the evidence laid out before them, and understanding that her father wasn't an immigrant who'd escaped communism. He was a trained intelligence officer who'd been sent to America with a false identity, and everything about their family, everything about her entire life, had been constructed to support his mission. Elena spent the next 48 hours trying to decide what to do with what she'd found. David wanted to go to the FBI immediately, arguing that every day they waited was another day their father could be passing information to Soviet handlers. Another day, American security was being compromised. But Elena needed something David didn't seem to need, which was to know whether anything about their father's feelings for them had been real, or whether she and her brother had simply been props in an elaborate performance designed to make Victor Mirova look like a legitimate American family man. She told David she was going to confront their father first, that she needed to hear him explain before she made the decision that would end his life as he knew it. David thought this was dangerous and possibly stupid, but Elena was the older sibling and always had been the one who made final decisions when they disagreed about important matters. So he accepted her choice, even as he made clear he thought it was the wrong one. On the afternoon of June 24th, Monday, Elena called her father at work and asked if he could meet her at the house that evening around 7. Her mother was still in Baltimore and wouldn't be back until Tuesday, and Elena told Victor she needed to discuss something private about the wedding, about gifts that needed to be returned, or thank you notes that required his input. Her voice must have carried something that made him suspicious because he asked if everything was all right, if there was a problem with Thomas or with the marriage. Elena assured him everything was fine, but that she needed to talk to him alone, and after a pause that lasted several seconds, Victor agreed to meet her. He arrived at 6:55, parking in the driveway and entering through the front door with the key he'd carried for 23 years. Elena was sitting in the living room, in the chair by the window where she used to read as a teenager, and when Victor walked in she could see him taking in the scene, noting that she looked tense and that her posture suggested this wasn't going to be the casual conversation about wedding logistics she'd described on the phone. He sat down on the couch across from her and asked what this was really about, his tone careful, his eyes watching her face for information. Elena reached into her purse, which sat on the floor beside her chair, and pulled out the photograph she'd found in her mother's jewelry box. She held it up so her father could see it, and she watched his expression change, a progression that moved through surprise and calculation and resignation in the space of about 3 seconds. Victor started to say something, then stopped, then tried a different approach. He told her that the photograph was from a long time ago, from before he came to America, that he'd done military service like many young men in the Soviet Union, and that the ceremony in the photograph had been some kind of official recognition for technical work he'd done. His voice was steady, reasonable, the voice of a man explaining something that had been misunderstood. Elena let him finish, then told him she'd seen the filing cabinet, that she knew about the passports and the maps and the document from 1961, and that she needed him to stop lying to her. The shift in Victor's demeanor was immediate and complete. The reasonable explanations stopped, and what replaced them was a kind of tactical silence, a pause while he recalculated his position and determined what he could admit and what he needed to protect. He asked her how long she'd known, and Elena told him about finding the photograph on her wedding day, about the search she and David had conducted while he was supposedly fishing. Victor closed his eyes briefly, and when he opened them, something in his face had changed. He asked if she'd told anyone else, and Elena said only David, not Thomas, not their mother, not any authorities. She said she'd come to him first because she needed to know if he'd ever actually loved them or if they'd just been part of his assignment. Victor's response came slowly, and he chose his words with visible care. He told her that yes, he had been sent to America by Soviet intelligence in 1961, that his identity as Victor Mirova was constructed, that his entire presence in the United States was part of an operation that had been planned for months before his arrival. He said he'd been trained for 2 years before being deployed, that he'd been given a background story and documents and instructions about how to build a credible American life. He admitted he'd married Susan because she was American-born, and marriage to her would help establish his legitimacy, and that Elena and David had been born because families with children drew less suspicion than childless couples. But he insisted, and his voice when he said this carried an intensity that seemed to come from somewhere genuine, that everything he'd felt for his family over the past 24 years had been real, that whatever his original purpose had been, he'd come to love Susan and Elena and David in ways that had nothing to do with his assignment. Elena asked if he was still active, still passing information to Soviet handlers, and Victor looked at her for a long moment before answering. He said he'd tried to stop, multiple times, that after Elena was born he'd attempted to extract himself from the operation, but that he'd been told explicitly that refusing to continue would result in consequences for his family. He didn't specify what those consequences were, but the implication was clear enough. He said he'd been trapped in a situation where his choices were to continue betraying his adopted country or put his wife and children at risk, and he'd chosen what he thought was the lesser evil. Elena asked him what he'd been passing, what kind of information he'd been giving to the Soviets, and Victor said mostly technical specifications and policy documents. Nothing that would get anyone killed, but information that gave Soviet analysts insight into American capabilities and intentions. He made it sound almost harmless, almost justifiable, and Elena felt a surge of anger at his attempt to minimize what he'd been doing. She told him she was going to report him to the FBI, that she had no choice given what she knew, and given that Thomas's career and her own future depended on her not being complicit in espionage. Victor didn't argue with her or try to talk her out of it. Instead, he asked for 24 hours, one day to make arrangements for Susan, to prepare her for what was coming, and to ensure she would be taken care of financially and legally. He said Susan had never known anything about his real identity, that she was completely innocent, and that she deserved some warning before federal agents appeared at the house. Elena considered this request, understanding it was also a test of whether she trusted him not to run or destroy evidence or alert his handlers during those 24 hours. She told him he had until 7 o'clock the following evening, and that if he tried to leave the area or contact anyone suspicious, she would call the FBI immediately. Victor nodded, stood up from the couch, and walked toward the door. Before leaving, he turned back and told her he was sorry for what he'd put her through, sorry for the position he'd placed her in, and that he understood why she was doing what she was doing. Then he left, and Elena sat in the living room alone, replaying the conversation in her mind and trying to determine what parts of what her father had said were true. Elena walked into the FBI field office in Washington at 9:30 on the morning of June 26th, carrying a folder containing the photographs David had taken and the original image she'd found in her mother's jewelry box. She'd called ahead and been told to ask for the counterintelligence division, and when she arrived, she was met by Special Agent Margaret Chen, a woman in her late 30s who listened to Elena's initial explanation with an expression that suggested professional skepticism, shifting gradually toward intense interest. Elena laid out the evidence methodically, showing the photographs first, then explaining about the filing cabinet, the passports, the maps with marked locations, and finally the document from 1961 that appeared to be some kind of assignment order. Agent Chen asked permission to make copies of everything, then left Elena sitting in a small conference room for nearly 40 minutes while the materials were reviewed by other agents and supervisors. When Chen returned, she was accompanied by a senior agent named Robert Kellerman, who introduced himself and asked Elena to walk them through everything again from the beginning, this time with more detail about dates and locations and exactly what her father had said during their conversation the previous evening. Elena recounted the confrontation, including Victor's admission that he'd been sent by Soviet intelligence and his claim that he'd tried to quit after she was born, but had been threatened. Kellerman asked if Elena had recorded the conversation, and she admitted she had, pulling a small cassette recorder from her purse and placing it on the table. The recording was 47 minutes long, and the agents listened to the entire exchange without interruption, taking notes as Victor's voice came through the small speaker, calm and measured even as he confessed to 24 years of espionage. After the recording ended, Kellerman informed Elena that the FBI had actually been aware of suspicious activity surrounding someone matching her father's profile, but had lacked sufficient evidence to obtain warrants or make an arrest. What she'd provided, he said, was exactly what they needed to move forward. He explained that they would execute an arrest warrant the following morning, June 27th, and that agents would take Victor into custody at the house in Bethesda before he left for work. Elena asked what would happen to her mother, and Kellerman said Susan would be interviewed extensively, but that based on Elena's account and their own observations, they believed she was likely unaware of her husband's true identity and activities. Then, Elena made a request that caused both agents to exchange glances. She told them she wanted help maintaining a cover story, not for her father's sake, but to protect her mother from the public shame of being known as the wife of a Soviet spy, to protect Thomas's security clearance from the taint of association, and to protect her own career from the inevitable suspicion that would follow if people knew her father was KGB. She proposed telling people that Victor had suffered a severe mental breakdown and was being treated at a private psychiatric facility, that the family was requesting privacy during this difficult time. Kellerman asked why she thought the FBI would agree to participate in such a deception, and Elena pointed out that if Victor's arrest became public knowledge immediately, any other Soviet agents in his network would be alerted and would likely shut down their operations or flee before the FBI could identify them. A quiet arrest and a convincing cover story would give the Bureau time to investigate Victor's contacts and potentially roll up a broader intelligence network. The agents left the room for another consultation, this time lasting nearly an hour. When they returned, Kellerman said they were willing to cooperate with the cover story, but only for a limited time, and only if it genuinely served investigative purposes. The arrest would be conducted with minimal visible law enforcement presence. Victor would be taken into custody without handcuffs or marked vehicles, and the initial charges would be filed under seal to prevent media coverage. The family would be allowed to tell neighbors and relatives that Victor was receiving treatment for psychiatric issues, and the FBI would not contradict that story publicly, as long as it remained useful to their investigation. Victor was arrested at 6:15 on the morning of June 27th, approximately 12 hours after Elena's meeting at the FBI field office. 2 agents arrived in an unmarked car and knocked on the door while Susan was in the kitchen making coffee, and Victor was upstairs getting dressed for work. Susan answered the door, confused by the early visitors, and the agents identified themselves quietly and asked to speak with her husband. When Victor came downstairs and saw them, he showed no surprise, simply nodded and told Susan he needed to go with these men to answer some questions about a work matter. Susan, still not understanding what was happening, asked when he'd be home, and Victor told her he wasn't sure but that she should call their lawyer if he wasn't back by evening. Then he walked out with the agents, got into their car, and was driven away while Susan stood in the doorway watching, her bathrobe pulled tight against the cool morning air. Elena arrived at the house 30 minutes later, having been notified by Agent Chen that the arrest had occurred. She found her mother sitting at the kitchen table, crying and asking what was happening, why the FBI had taken Victor, what kind of trouble he was in. Elena sat down across from her and began telling the story she'd prepared, the fiction about mental health issues and stress, and a breakdown that had been building for months. She said Victor had been having paranoid thoughts, that he'd been behaving erratically at work, that doctors believed he needed immediate psychiatric evaluation and treatment. Susan listened, her face showing the kind of blank incomprehension that comes with trying to process information that doesn't match observed reality, and she asked why no one had told her, why she hadn't noticed anything wrong. Elena said Victor had been hiding it, not wanting to worry the family, trying to handle it himself until it had gotten too serious to manage without professional help. The story held for approximately 6 months. Susan accepted it because she had no reason not to, because her husband had been taken away by federal agents who'd been polite and professional and hadn't treated him like a criminal, and because her daughter was telling her something that, while frightening, was at least comprehensible within the framework of illness and treatment. David was told the truth 2 weeks after the arrest, when it became clear he couldn't maintain the fiction convincingly around their mother without knowing what was actually happening. His response was a cold anger directed primarily at Elena, not for turning their father in, but for lying to their mother and expecting him to participate in the deception. Thomas had been told the truth immediately, because his security clearance required full disclosure of any family member involved in criminal activity, and his reaction had been a careful distance, a professional understanding mixed with personal resentment that Elena had brought this situation into his life. Victor pleaded guilty in August to multiple counts of espionage under a plea agreement that allowed him to avoid a public trial in exchange for cooperation with counterintelligence debriefings. He was sentenced to 25 years in federal prison and transferred to a facility in Pennsylvania, where he would spend the next 2 decades. The plea agreement and sentencing occurred under seal, with only a brief public filing that mentioned the case, but provided no details about the defendant's identity or the nature of his crimes. As far as most people who knew the Mirova family were concerned, Victor was still receiving treatment for psychiatric issues at a private facility somewhere in upstate New York, a fiction that would eventually collapse under its own weight, but that served its purpose for a while. The fiction about Victor's mental breakdown ended in January of 1986, 7 months after his arrest, when Victor's attorney contacted Susan directly about signing divorce papers. The lawyer, operating under the assumption that Susan knew her husband was in federal prison for espionage, began discussing property division and the legal implications of having been married to a convicted spy. Susan, still believing Victor was receiving psychiatric treatment, asked what the attorney was talking about, and in the confusion that followed, the truth came out. She called Elena immediately, her voice shaking with a fury Elena had never heard from her before, demanding to know if what the lawyer had just told her was true. Elena confirmed it, and Susan's next question, delivered with devastating precision, was how long Elena had known. When Elena admitted she'd known since her wedding day, that she'd been the one to report Victor to the FBI, and that she'd been lying about his whereabouts for 7 months, Susan hung up the phone. She didn't speak to Elena again for 3 years. The consequences of what Elena had done, or what had been done to her depending on how the situation was viewed, rippled outward through her life in ways she hadn't fully anticipated. David stopped speaking to her for 4 years, not because he disagreed with her decision to report their father, but because he believed she'd handled it in the worst possible way, lying to their mother and asking him to participate in a deception that had ultimately caused more harm than the truth would have. Her relationship with Thomas deteriorated steadily throughout 1986 and 1987. The strain of the security clearance investigations and the background checks, and the subtle professional damage from being associated with a Soviet spy eventually becoming too much for the marriage to sustain. They divorced in 1989, and Thomas moved to California for a job with a private sector defense contractor, putting 3,000 miles between himself and the situation Elena had brought into his life. Elena never had children. This was a conscious decision, made in 1990 after several years of therapy and reflection, based on her understanding that she couldn't trust herself to create a family when her own experience of family had been built on lies and false identities. She told her therapist that she worried she'd inherited something from her father, some capacity for deception or compartmentalization that might make her unfit for parenthood, though the therapist suggested that this concern itself indicated a level of self-awareness that argued against the fear. Regardless of the logic, Elena remained certain, and as she moved through her 30s and into her 40s, she built a life that was deliberately solitary and carefully controlled, working as a translator for the State Department while keeping her personal connections minimal and her emotional investments limited. She visited her father in prison once, in the spring of 1995, driving to the Federal Correctional Facility in Pennsylvania on a Saturday morning, and sitting across from him in a visiting room that smelled of industrial cleaner and contained dozens of other families having quiet conversations at small tables. Victor was 62 years old by then, his hair completely white, his face thinner than she remembered, wearing the standard prison uniform that made him look like everyone else in the room, rather than the distinguished engineer and devoted father she'd grown up with. They talked for nearly 2 hours, and Victor told her about his recruitment in the 1950s, how he'd been orphaned during the war and raised in a state facility, how Soviet intelligence had offered him education and purpose in exchange for service. He explained that he'd tried to defect in 1972, the year before Elena was born, but had been told that his family would be targeted if he refused to continue his work. He asked if she had children, and when she said no, something in his expression suggested he understood why, and that the knowledge caused him genuine pain. In 2005, the FBI declassified portions of Victor's case file as part of a broader release of Cold War-era documents, and Elena requested copies under the Freedom of Information Act. Reading through the files, she learned details about her father's operation that he'd never told her, including the fact that his attempted defection in 1972 had been serious, and that he'd made contact with CIA officers in Vienna during a trip he'd claimed was for a technical conference. The defection had been aborted when his Soviet handlers had shown him photographs of Susan and David, who was 8 years old at the time, with the implicit threat clear. Elena also learned that her father's intelligence production had declined significantly after 1973, that the information he'd been passing had become increasingly low-level and sometimes deliberately misleading, suggesting he'd been trying to minimize the damage he was causing while still maintaining enough cooperation to protect his family. The files didn't absolve him of responsibility for 24 years of espionage, but they complicated the narrative Elena had been carrying about his motivations and choices. Susan remarried in 1994 to a retired accountant named Harold Chen, and she eventually reconciled with Elena in the late 2000s, though their relationship remained formal and distant, lacking the easy intimacy that had existed before January 1986. David reconciled with Elena in 1990, calling her on her birthday and suggesting they have dinner, and over time they rebuilt something that resembled a sibling relationship, though both of them understood that what had been broken couldn't be fully repaired. Victor died in prison in December of 2010 at the age of 77 from complications of pneumonia, having served 25 years of his sentence. Elena was notified by the Bureau of Prisons and made arrangements for his body to be cremated and his ashes scattered in a location he'd specified in his will, a lake in Pennsylvania where he'd actually gone fishing occasionally during those monthly trips, one of the few things about his life that had been genuine. When Elena went through her father's belongings, the items the prison had returned to his family after his death, she found a cardboard box containing approximately 200 letters, all addressed to her, all written over the course of his 25 years in prison, none of them ever sent. The letters chronicled his daily life in prison but focused primarily on memories of Elena's childhood, detailed recollections of specific moments like teaching her to ride a bicycle, or helping her with algebra homework, or attending her high school graduation. He wrote about his regret for the choices he'd made, for the situation he'd placed her in, for the damage his life had caused to everyone he'd claimed to love. He wrote about wondering whether anything he'd felt had been real, or whether he'd simply been performing emotions so long that he'd convinced himself they were genuine. And in the final letter, written a week before his death, he told her that whatever else had been false about his life, his love for her had been the one true thing, the one part of his existence that hadn't been constructed or assigned or performed for operational purposes. Elena read all 200 letters over the course of a single weekend, sitting in her apartment in Arlington, and when she finished, she still didn't know whether to believe him. She understood that she would spend the rest of her life trying to separate what had been real from what had been performance in her father's life, and that she would probably never arrive at a definitive answer. The letters themselves might have been one final act of manipulation, or they might have been the most honest communication her father had ever offered her. There was no way to know for certain, and that uncertainty, more than anything else, was what Victor Mirova had left his daughter as his inheritance.